Greetings, brethren and sisters. Welcome to Gillie Revolutionary channel. Today I want to introduce you to the Maroons of Motown, a community with a rich but complex history in Portland, Jamaica. Descended from Africans who escaped British plantation, they waged a fierce resistance using guerrilla warfare to secure their freedom in 1739. Led by the legendary Nanny of the Maroons, they built an independent society that still thrives today. However, as part of their treaty with the British, they were also required to help capture runaway slaves and suppress rebellions, a legacy that remains debated. Despite this, Motown is a proud symbol of resilience, preserving Maroon culture through language, music, and governance, so much so that UNESCO recognized their heritage as invaluable. Please bear in mind that this is a true history we are trying to relate. Thank you very much.
Welcome once again to Gillie Revolutionary TV channel. Today I will delve into another special subject and topic, and it's one that I wanted to address for a while now, and it is one that people keep asking me to address from various different angles for different reasons. They would like to hear my opinion on it. From my part, I've always wanted to address this issue, but could not really even find the time to really address, because at one point I believe it's pertinent, but on another point I really don't feel the relevance of it. But as I'm getting into certain discussion with people on the same topic, especially there's an organization down here in Jamaica that refers to itself, I don't recall its proper name, but it is seen itself as representing the indigenous people of Jamaica, and in trying to get them to identify to me what do they mean by indigenous in the Jamaican context. The only clear point that they have been able to bring across to me is really to basically attacking those people who refer to themselves in Jamaica as the Maroons. And from representative of this indigenous group, they tend to see everything about the Maroons in Jamaica from a negative perspective. In a nutshell, they have come to see the Maroons in Jamaica as nothing more than being a fifth column of the British colonial government of the time, the British slaveocracy at the time, basically seeing the Maroon as military enclaves, military auxiliary to the British forces in order to perpetuate slavery upon the land and then later colonialism. Some of the way how they tend to identify the Maroons of Jamaica, some of it is not even worth mentioning because it's more like, say, on a imaginary level. They have conjured up ideas about the Maroon from a negative perspective. It doesn't mean that the Maroon does not or did not in the past facilitated or helped to facilitate certain negative colonial policies upon the island by being in alliance with the British. But anyway, I'll just bring it to the point where I would like to start it from. My grandmother, Miss Agatha Smart, is a member of the original Maroons from the eastern part of Jamaica, what they call the windward part of Jamaica, the eastern part of Jamaica. And she and her people and her ancestors originated out of a place in the Blue Mountains by the name of Motown. And Motown, over the centuries, had passed through different names. At one point, they were Muritown, M-U-R-I Town. At one point, it was Nanny Town. At one point, it was the new Nanny Town. Went through different stages, different names. But the permanent settlement today, which is referred to as Moortown, M-O-O-R-E, Moortown, is in the parish of Portland in the eastern side of Jamaica. And that is where you can go today and really visit the Maroons, or people who are referred to as the Maroons, and some of who refer to themselves as the Maroons. Now, just kind of give a little brief snatch history is that in the eastern part of Jamaica, at one time there was one Maroon town, and this was referred to as Nanny Town. And this Nanny Town, and just for clarity for those who hear me say Nanny Town, is taking up the same Moore-town in Jamaica. At one time it was one Maroon town on the eastern part of the island. On the west you have a compound down in Trelawney, St. Elizabeth, and those other places you had Maroon enclaves. But sometime after the leadership of Jamaica National Hero Nanny, who was the leader and founder of Nanny Town in the 1720s, 1730s, somewhere around here, the Maroon Town split eventually. It was one Maroon Town referred to as Nanny Town, and over the time being, it split it up. So based upon leadership dispute, one individual, I don't remember if his name was Oba, whatever his name was, he took a segment of the Maroon Town from original Nanny Town, and they moved to Charlestown. This is still in the parish of Portland, but over there by Buff Bay, like the suburb part of Buff Bay. And then eventually there was another split when they moved to Charlestown, and they moved to the name is not coming to me right now, but it's gonna come to me. They moved to Scott Hall in St. Mary. So first there was one Maroon Town, Nanny Town, then that community split based upon dispute amongst the leadership after the death of Nanny. To split it, one segment was taken by her brother and taken to Charlestown in Buff Bay. Then there was another split by another member of the family, and it was then taken, a segment of the Maroon Town in Charlestown was then taken to Scott Hall in St. Mary. So that's a broad sweep of history into a nutshell pertaining to the Maroons in eastern Jamaica. But what suffice to say is that at one point there was one Maroon Town, one Maroon enclave on the entire eastern part of the island. Today, if you visit Jamaica, you can have access to 3 basic Maroon community. Now, the term Maroon is a term that I have problem with. And I believe that I am in a unique position to address whatever negative aspect I may be seeing of the historical actions of the Maroons in Jamaica, because I can address it, among others, because it's not like I am an outsider addressing something that basically you will say because you're an outsider you have a particular perspective which may be different and negative to the perspective of someone who would have been or may have been a member of the Maroon community. My grandmother, Miss Agatha, like I stated earlier, originated from Moortown. That's on my father's side. My grandmother on my mother's side, Lillian Hendrickson, she originated out of Scott Hall. That's from the Maroon Town that presently exists in St. Mary. So both paternally and maternally, I am a descendant from the so-called Maroon enclave, Maroon community, the Maroon people. But the name Maroon is not a name I ascribe to. You know, even though I use that term in this particular broadcast, it's just for clarity. But I would never go out in the world and encounter anyone and refer to myself as a Maroon. And why is that so? Because it is an appellation, it is a terminology, it is a name that was bequeathed to my people by the colonial powers. I word Maroon, Cimarron coming out of the Spanish language, and then later adapted within the English language. So it went from Cimarron to Maroon, and today you find thousands of people willingly assume, whether from ignorance or not, that apply that term to themselves. So recently, there's this virgin who identifies himself as a leader of the indigenous community in Jamaica. And when I first encountered him, I find his argument very curious from the perspective of when he uses the term indigenous, or when his organization uses the term indigenous, what does he actually mean by that terms? I did not want to apply a terminology from my own understanding or from a dictionary position. I want to hear it. So his basic position, if I may take the liberty to speak on his behalf in terms of the definition of indigenous, is that in a historical context, he goes back to the time when there were Africans in Jamaica. This is before the coming of Columbus, before the coming of the what you refer to as the Indians from the Americas into Jamaica. And basically, from his argument, Africans were here, then the Indians came and then they interbred, and then the Spaniard came in 14 something, and they interbred and got killed and dispersed. And then the second wave of African came in. This was now during the slave trade, and they also interbreeded with some of them. So from his position, that is what is known as the indigenous people of Jamaica. But what makes them more indigenous than any other thing is because they were here as the free people, which were what he referred to as the Moors that traveled from Africa. Free people came and occupied an occupied land. Then the Indians from the Americas, I know they don't usually accept that term as Indian, but because they are so various, I'm just going to use that term collectively, but not from a disrespectful position. So then the Moors that came to Jamaica originally, when there were no occupants in this country, they interbreed with the Indians that came. Then they interbreed forcefully through rape and plunder by the Spaniard and the British that came later. And these people were also the first resistors on the island. They formed the first resistance against Spanish occupation and the British occupation. But what I also gather from his argument is that the fact that they were the first to resist the occupation of the island by the Spaniard and the British, that resistance is what gives them the legitimate claims to be the only freedom fighters that ever existed in Jamaica. Now, from his story also, and this is the part where it's not meshing to my understanding of the semblance of issue that I understand, from the indigenous people's argument, this organization, when we're talking about people in Jamaica that just look just like me and you, that claiming a separate indigenousness from the people of Jamaica. And basically is that the Maroons were people who were placed on ships, brought to Jamaica as an auxiliary military force to assist the British and the Spaniards in capturing Jamaica, enslaving the people, and colonializing the people after 1838. Okay, I don't know where that is to come from. I'm just relating it as it being related to me, to my limited understanding of this organization that claims they are fighting on behalf of the indigenous people of Jamaica. Now, getting back to my grandmother now, the specific one who's from Moortown in the parish of Portland. I had always known and heard from my father's side of the family of our so-called Maroon heritage. Remember, I'm not a person that uses that term, but I'm just using it for conversation and the reasoning. And recently I was going through some documents that my father bequeathed to the family, some historical documents and papers, and in general, what he left when he passed away. And then I kept seeing in papers he's making reference to his mother, Agatha Smart, and the fact that she came out of Maroon Town, that she met our grandfather in a place in something like Cavalry Cottage, somewhere that up in the Blue Mountains of Portland. So at one point, she had migrated from one part of the Maroon Town, or one part of the Maroon village, to the borders of the Maroon Town, and that was where she met my grandfather, Mr. George Aaron. And this George Aaron has a whole total different history that is worth relating one time. but in another space at another time in another documentary. Because originally, what the family has learned over the years, that our original name was not Aaron in terms of, on my father's side, it was not Aaron, it was Clark. But then there's a whole issue surrounding the changing of the name. And at one point, some of the family original name was Aaron, but his line was not Aaron. And then he adopted the Aaron and set aside the Clark. But anyway, he met Agatha Smart, formed a relationship. I think they had 4 children. One whose name was Mary, one name was Cornelius, who we refer to as Uncle Con, and my brother, my father, Alvin, and there's another brother, I think he died young, which would have been my uncle. His name I cannot recall at this moment. So after reading the documents and everything, I decided that I was gonna, even before my encounter with the documents that my father bequeathed to us, I have always known the fact that my maternal and paternal grandparents were Maroons. I always have this urge ever since a child to visit a Maroon town, not a particular Maroon town, but any Maroon town. Then years later now, coming into the knowledge of my mother's mother from Scotland, Maroon town of Scotland in St. Mary, and my father's mother from Moortown in Portland, then as my urge now started to become more particular to visit these 2 Maroon towns, to walk the path where my grandparents, to walk the path where my ancestors had walked at the foot of the Blue Mountains, to walk the path where my ancestors had fought against the British, to walk the path where they had secured a semblance of sovereignty and a semblance of independence. And I'm using that word in a very narrow and particular context, independence, because it was still encased within a British domain. And the urge was always there. And that urge became more pronounced during my imprisonment. So upon being released, I decided that several months after to visit Moortown. Why Moortown and not Scotland is for some reason because I encountered new documents. Maybe that documents gave me the urge and had me leaning towards Moortown more than I leaned towards. But so we go. On my way to Moortown, funnily, on my way to Moortown, coming through the junction, that's when you come by Stony Hill and you're going down. You come by Stony Hill and you're going down the junction to go through the parish of St. Mary. We came upon a roadblock. And all the traffic had backed up. So we had to take a different route in order to reach Portland. It so happened that this route that we had to take took us through Scotland, the Maroon town of Scotland in St. Mary. And in driving through Scotland and seeing the signs, welcome to Scotland, the Maroon town, the era when it was established, so on and so forth, I literally felt the presence of my ancestors. Yes, anytime I'm anywhere in Jamaica, I feel the presence of my ancestors. But this was a particular feeling, just knowing that there was a possibility that this very road that I'm traveling on was once traveled by my grandmother on my mother's side of the family, Lillian Hendricks, I believe, yeah. So we made it to Portland eventually because I was going specifically to Moortown. And then there were some other adventures on my way to Moortown. But when I finally reached Moortown the following day, because I left Kingston on a Sunday, and I did not reach Moortown until the Monday. And I walked through the town first by myself, just walking. I asked a few questions. Where could I locate the residence of the colonel? The colonel is the official title of the chief, using that word loosely, of who governed Moortown, the Maroon town. And I was directed to his residence. I went there, shouted out, knocked on the gate. No one was there. I was then informed by a close by neighbor that the colonel may be in his provision ground, meaning that he's going off to plant some stuff in his agricultural field. So then later I was recommended that I should go and speak to the curator of the history of Moortown. And they have this building which they refer to as, I think, pardon me if I'm mispronounced, Akabwa. The Akabwa House is what we would basically call a community center, but more than a community center, more like an historical museum. And this Akabwa is where the regulars, the drums, the historical documents, some of the historical documents, historical implements are stored. And this curator is responsible for creating the history of the Maroon Town community to visitors or anyone of a curious mind who may inquire about the history of Maroon Town, about the history of the people. So I decided to engage him. And I got a very mixed feeling from the engagement with him. But I will put it in the context. So anyway, I relate to them about my grandmother, Miss Agatha Smart. And I'm here to search for any historical documents that can be made possibly available to me so I could go through to see basically if I have any ancestors who still remain in Moortown. I was told that the historical records are kept at the school, at the primary school, the Moortown Primary School that's in Moortown, that all the records are kept in the school building, that I would have to first get the permission of the colonel, this is the chief of the Maroon Town, before I could review the records. But basically, so during the interview with the curator of the Maroons history inside of the Akabwa, he basically let me know that he has two speeches that he usually presents to visitors. One that's geared and tailored specifically towards a tourist, and another one to any other persons from Jamaica who may seek a knowledge of the history. Right, he basically have two stories that he tells to visitors to Maroon Town. One that's tailored specifically for tourism, for outsiders, for foreigners, and one for basically whenever Jamaican visits. And the one that is given to the tourists that visit the Maroon Town, that one is geared towards also not only facilitating a certain knowledge to the visitors, but we assist in the tourism promotional aspect of the town, because they basically, that's the way they raise funds. That's the way they are able to take care of the communal needs of the community, from funds that comes in from both foreign and local visitors. In the beginning is the interview with this creator, I noticed that immediately, for some reason, whatever may have triggered it, I don't know, but the spill that he began to give me about the history of the Maroon Town is from an almost a defensive position. It is as if he had expected me, or he was expecting me to attack the community. Why that, I don't know. But he began by telling me, basically running me through the history of the Maroon people and the history of the town. And at one point he began telling me of how the name Moor arrived. The name of the village, Moortown. So he started telling me about how Moortown arrived, the name. And from his explanation is that Moortown, the name Moor, derived from the fact that the Moors, these are people who are from North Africa. The Moors really named Mauritania, the country Mauritania, and along the Mediterranean strip of North Africa. These Africans were referred to by European occupiers, by the Greek and the Latins and so forth, as the Moors, and which is a term that's basically in the European language that the name derived from means black or dark skin. Anyway, so his explanation in the name of the town in Jamaica is that the Moor, the town derived its name more from these Africans who first came from Africa from the days of antiquity. When he explained that to me, I could hear within the way how he was verbalizing, this was a newly derived justification for the town having the name Moors. From my limited reading, right, a lot of these Maroon towns derive their name from some British imposed superintendent that were stationed and based within these Maroon towns. What happened in general was this. When the British and the Maroons and all the different enclaves signed a peace treaty to acknowledge the fact that these people, the Maroons, were existing within their own sovereignty. They wanted their own sovereignty. They were not willing to bow down in any form or fashion to slavery. These towns were acknowledged, and eventually a British imposed name was placed upon these communities. From historical records, a lot of these names that were imposed upon these communities, Scott Hall, Moortown, Charlestown, Flagstaff, that's down in the western part of the island, the Maroon town, Flagstaff, Acompo. A lot of these names were given and derived from British imposed superintendents who, as a part of the agreement that was signed between the Maroons and the British, a senior British civil official had to be based inside the Maroon town. It's almost like an ambassador was placed inside the Maroon town, where the British colonial government could use as a liaison between themselves and the Maroon leaders. So over the historical period of time, a lot of these towns derived their name from one of these superintendents that was stationed there by the British. And from my understanding, one of those superintendents that was based in Nannytown, or in the latter name, New Nannytown, his name was Moore. And therefore, that was how the government began referring to these names. So if the superintendent, or one of the first superintendent, or the first superintendent that was stationed in that Maroon town, and his name was Moore, then the British government in their documents would refer to it as Moortown, meaning that was the town where the British superintendent by the name of Moore administered on behalf of the British government. But somehow later in this coming down history, in trying to be, from my personal humble perspective, in they trying to be revisionist, in trying to give more to the term more than its actual true meaning. They have adapted over the years now this Moor history from North Africa, those Moors from the Mediterranean area who had historically conquered and dominated the European continent. They have now adapted that definition of a Moor towards the colonial imposed Moor. So that when he explaining that, and I remember interjecting a question, I asked him, are you speaking specifically about the Moors of North Africa? These Moors that you are claiming came here and occupied Jamaica before there were any inhabitants of Jamaica? A part of the issue that I agree with, that there were Africans in this side of the world before any other people. And he said yes. I said okay. Then he began walking me through the history. And then there was a point in his presentation where he began getting defensive again. For whatever reason, like I said before, I don't know what triggered it. I don't know if he had been through these type of interviews. Yes, I assume he had been through interviews before, but he may have been questioned about the role that the Maroons played in putting, once their sovereignty was acknowledged by the British government, the role that they played in putting down rebellions throughout the island on behalf of the colonial government. So I guess he began forming his presentation from that perspective to give justification to the actions of the Maroons before I even asked the question. So then he began telling me about, in a most derogatory way, that those people, those Africans who remained on the plantation during the time of slavery, that they were referred to by the Maroons in the hills as Bongo people. And that the Bongo term was a derogatory term that they used towards them, because in his language they had accepted slavery, that they had accepted slavery in exchange for 3 meals a day and the lashes of the whips. He began speaking in a very derogatory term against people who did not have the availability, or did not avail themselves of running away from the slave plantations into the mountains to join the Maroons. After he completed his presentation, he began showing me some colonial implements, like, for example, the self-eating irons. Those Jamaicans of a certain age may know the iron that you could open the top of it and put coal in it, light the coal, close it, and you iron your clothes with. He began showing me ice shear. This was shears that you used to shear ice. So that back in the days you could put syrup on the shear ice and you could eat it. He began showing me a lot of old British implements as a part of the Maroon issue. I don't understand how the British colonial implements became a part of the Maroon issue. It's not as if he was telling me about these colonial instruments and telling me the part that it played in the Maroon history. It was not even included in his presentation that these implements were used by, he was just showing me old British stuff and as a part of Maroon history, without saying how it was affiliated with, how it attached to Maroon history. So there was a conflation now taking place in his presentation between Maroon history and early 17th, 18th, 19th century colonial implements. It was as if these implements were relied upon to bolster, to boost up the Maroon issues, as if they had run out of argument, run out of artifacts, and they needed something to make the presentation longer, so they just threw all these British colonial implements in it. After he gave me the presentation, we then made a walk through the town. He took me to the monument that they built to the present name of the chief that runs Moortown. His name is Sterling. His predecessor, he took me to the monument for him. He took me to the monument where he said exactly where Nanny, the original leader of Nannytown, the original leader of Moortown, and of my ancestors are buried, and we paid homage to them. And basically, I waited for a period of time to meet the colonel, but the colonel was away, and there was a time where I couldn't wait any longer, so I had to leave. So I did not get the opportunity to meet with Colonel Sterling, an opportunity I really regret, but that would have to take place another time if the opportunity presents itself. Now let me look at this Maroon history. Do I believe that the Maroon played both a negative and a positive history in the development of Jamaica and in the development of the freedom struggle throughout the world? Yes, I do believe that. I highly acknowledge the fact that the people who we refer to as the Maroons, the people of part of whom I am descended from, they have fought illustrious battles across the length and breadth of Jamaica for the freedom. They have played a role in inspiring, even if you go back and read history, inspiring even the Asian Revolution. There are documents written from the Asian historical perspective where they acknowledge that the greatest inspiration for them in fighting the Asian Revolution was following through the grapevine the battles, the heroic battles of the Maroons in Jamaica. And let's not forget about Bookman, the Jamaicans who traveled to Haiti and initiated the Haitian Revolution that culminated in the first black sovereign state that existed from overthrowing of a slaveocracy. A revolution that further inspired the total political liberation of the African continent. It inspired the entire liberation of black people throughout the world. And that's a fact. And that inspiration that inspired African liberation struggles began right here well, I'm not going to say began right here in Jamaica, but was inspired greatly from the heroic struggle from the people of Jamaica. But there's a part of the history of the Maroon that we tend to hide from. We hide from it through discussion, we hide from it through creating a fabricated sense of the history of the part that the Maroons play in assisting, and it's written in some of the treaty, in assisting the British in putting down rebellions on the island during the time of colonialism and during the time of slavery. Maroons played a detrimental part in putting down the Morant Bay Rebellion that was led by Paul Bogle. The War of Liberation that fought in the western part of Jamaica that is referred to commonly as the Baptist War that was led by Sam Sharp was put down and assisted greatly by the Maroons in the western part of the island. So these are some of even the documents, even the treaty that was signed by the British, between the British and the Maroons, in acknowledging the sovereignty or the partial sovereignty of all the Maroons towns throughout the length and breadth of Jamaica. Including in those treaties is the deal that was made for the Maroons to assist the British whenever they are called upon to put down the rebellion. Now, we also know from British historical record that a lot of time when the Maroons participated in suppressing rebellions throughout the island, by some leaders at certain times were not willing participants. Sometimes they even refused. Other times they were led by these superintendents that were stationed within the sovereign Maroon enclaves. They were led by these superintendents in attacking other Africans. The people who were in bondage, who were fighting for liberation, people who were in colonialism, under colonial dictates, who were fighting to break free of colonialism. The Maroons today do not like to acknowledge the fact that at some point of our history, we played a fifth columnist role in putting down rebellions throughout the island in the service of the British Empire. And hiding from that fact does not help the situation. Fabricating a history to give justification to such dastardly act will not prevent us from facing that one day. And a lot of the Maroon leaders today, a lot of the colonels today, if not all of the colonels today, even though I've not held conversation to them, something I would like to indulge in the future of creating a forum to discuss these things. Hiding from that reality, that negative aspect of assisting the British in putting down rebellion through the island, will not let you get away from it. Will not allow us to get away from it. Will not allow myself as a descendant of Maroon to get away from it. We must face it squarely. Just as today, every government, when they review their own historical record, will find where they have erred in certain commitment, erred in certain actions, violated certain principles upon which they claim they stand. The Maroons cannot escape that history. We as Maroons must face the fact that at certain point within the history, we became collaborators against our own people. And until we reach that mental capacity where we can face it, acknowledge it, apologize for it, and move on, we're always going to be hiding behind that shadow. Always cannot squarely face the fact that we became auxiliary. Nani did not sign this treaty. Nani refused to sign the treaty to become collaborators with the British government against slaveocracy and the colonizing aspect of our history. And we are not doing our people any justice by hiding from it. And when the Maroon curator in Motown was making his presentation to me during the interview, you could see where he was struggling to find the appropriate words, to find languages, till he started to venture off into condemnation of the very people that they themselves fought. You see how history takes its place? Liberation struggle was being fought throughout the island of Jamaica. At certain point, certain Maroon communities assisted the British government in suppressing these rebellions. And then you are going to turn around and fabricate that issue that these people willingly accept 3 meals a day and lashes in exchange for subjugating themselves and their ancestors to slavery and colonialization. You have went to the point of exhibiting a more dastardly mentality against the Jamaican people in order to justify their historical auxiliary part that they played in the suppression of rebellions throughout the island. So, for me, as a descendant of Maroons, for me, and again, I do not use that term or appellation in identifying myself, because I'm not going to call myself no Maroon. I'm not going to call myself a name that was imposed upon my people, first by the Spaniard and then by the British, and find some pride in a colonial name. I'm not going to do that. And I specifically asked the curator, do you accept the name to be referred to as Motown, and do you accept the term Maroon as an identifiable appellation to yourself? And he says, yes, we are proud of it. And that's the curator of the Maroons today, a person, and I don't really want to narrow it down to him as an individual, but where the leadership within this community do not even have the consciousness to look at where these terminologies derive from and question them and ask themselves, why do we apply these appellations to ourselves? Why do we apply these terminologies to ourselves when we know they were derived from slaveocracy and colonialization that was imposed upon us as a people? Why do we still accept it today? And then taking that step further and trying to degrade the very people who you fought on the British side to keep in slavery and keep in bondage. Does that history makes me feel good as a person who descends from the Maroons? No, it does not make me feel good. And therefore, I will not participate in any language, in any fake history to justify such a dastardly history. I will not do that. Cannot do that. Knowing a lie and defending that lie by creating this false, heroic history when we as a people already have a certain aspect of our history that is heroic, that make us all proud, that strengthen us mentally, physically, spiritually. We do not need to go on later and fabricate and create a cover up to the negative part that we played in the liberation struggle in Jamaica. No, we must face it squarely. We must acknowledge and accept the fact that some of our leaders fell short, that some of our leaders got manipulated. You look at Motown. Motown began as one town, one sovereign enclave that was founded and led by the person today who is a Jamaican national hero. Nani, why is Nani acknowledged as a national hero of Jamaica, as a Maroon leader, when other Maroon leaders are not presently acknowledged? It's because she refused to sign the treaty. She refused to become and use her military forces to become an auxiliary to the British to put down rebellions of those who were seeking freedom. She refused it. And when she refused it, now look what happened. After she refused it, rebellion rose up against her within Nannytown, even one led by her own brother. And he took a force. The British gave him land in Charlestown, close to where present-day Buff Bay in Portland is today. And they said, well, now you ask yourself, why? Why did the British give the rebellious Abba Nanny's brother a brand new community that was stationed close to the town of Buff Bay? At that time, Buff Bay was a military enforced base where the colonial and the slave classes lived and had plantation. So they created the town of Charlestown, and I'm going to assume that the name Charlestown came from the superintendent, this ambassador that was stationed there by the British within the middle of the Maroon town, so he could be a spy upon them, so he could influence their decision. And they know Charlestown became an auxiliary force attached to the British forces to make sure there was no uprising or the threat of life to the colonialists and the slave owners who reside in the town of Buff Bay. The same thing with Scotland. So what they did, they created splits within the Maroon towns, cater to those leaders who wanted to split, offer them land to live on, gave them their own sense of sovereignty, and station and gave them property close to the towns where the British knew that they could call upon their military forces to assist them in putting down rebellions. And for some reason, at that time, they did not see how they were being manipulated by the British. Today, that manipulation, which played an auxiliary role in keeping down oppressions and rebellions throughout the island, the Maroon leaders today are covering it up. They don't want to acknowledge that fact. So what they do, they speak derogatory towards those who remain in slavery, try to hide from the fact, and then sometimes they try to give a little shield by saying, okay, even though it was signed into the treaty that the Maroons were to assist the British in putting down rebellions, in returning anyone back to slavery if they ran away. There's even a part in the history where some of the Maroons, at certain point in their history, kept slaves, took those who had ran away and put them in bondage. And even though they've given a justification that by saying that a lot of these runaway, they felt at that time were spies. They were not real runaway, that they were sent by the British forces to spy out the Maroon land, so the British military could come in and conquer them. So because they knew they were a spy, they enslaved them. That may be true, that may not be true. But the fact remains is each and every aspect of the negative roles that the Maroons play in the history of Jamaica, they have created a fabricated history to cover it up, believing that by covering it up, it is going to. Now, the more you're covering it up, is the more it is going to be called for exposure. So I know there are going to be Maroons who are watching this program, and they're going to say, they're going to question, what type of Maroon am I? What type of Maroon am I? What Maroon would come out and attack his own? I'm not attacking the community. I'm just shining a light in your face. If you want to perceive it as an attack, go ahead and perceive it as an attack. I am not going to run from either of my history. There is blood that flows in me that derives from those who remained in bondage right up to 1838. And there is blood that flowed through my vein that never went through slavery in Jamaica. And there is blood that flows through my vein that experienced slavery and then ran away and joined the Maroons in the hills. I have all that blood in me and more, and I will not disassociate myself from any aspect of it. So that is what I basically wanted to address. The fact that there's a false issue going around in Jamaica from many different angles, where you have those organizations that refer to themselves as representatives of the indigenous people of Jamaica, we're basically trying to wipe away the entire history of the Maroons by creating a whole fabricated history about the Maroons, that they came here on ship as auxiliary forces from Africa to help fight and put down rebellion on the side of the British. That is false. That is a false sense of history. There was no special shipload brought from Africa as a military auxiliary force known as Maroon to assist the British. That's garbage. And that argument is going around in Jamaica, just as it is garbage and should dispel the fact that those who are trying to say that the Maroons never assisted the slaveocracy and the colonial forces to put down rebellion on the island. Because we know that is true. The Maroons did that. My ancestors played a part of that. Because my ancestors derived from Maroon, from both Motown and Scotland. And I'm not going to run from that fact. It is a fact. We played a negative as well as a positive role in the historical development of Black and African liberation struggle throughout the world. And because the thing is this, you say if we don't acknowledge the fact as written by our historical act, we are bound to repeat it. Once we try to hide from certain fact that we acted on the side of the colonial forces, the slaveocracy, in putting down rebellions of our very own people who were fighting for freedom and liberation and justice and truth. Once we hide from that dastardly part of our history, we will do it again. And I tell you what, there's a movement amongst the Maroon taking place today. We are noticing now, especially in the western part of the island, a compound Flagstaff. I'm not too certain about Flagstaff, but we're down by a compound town here. They are claiming now the Muslim religion. They are claiming that when they came here, they were all Muslim. They have now taken on this Islamic appellage, where you can tell that there's an argument that's been invading the Maroon towns. You know, and that has to be dealt with, man. That has to be dealt with. Whether you are the individual Muslim that came here, for the cultural cementing of the community as one in Jamaica, where all tribes and languages and culture came together. It was not an Islamic one. There is something sinister and dastardly taking place within the Maroon communities across the length and breadth of Jamaica that needs to be dealt with. You go on some of these Maroon enclaves, they are more colonial minded than even the regular Jamaicans. And they are colonial minded in the sense where they have this highfalutin self of importance, where they separate themselves and try to distinguish themselves from the common Jamaican through a false history. Yes, there are historical documents giving my ancestors the right, before the abolition of slavery, to have their own sovereign, acknowledging their own sovereign existence within the hills of Jamaica. Let me tell you something about another small part about my family that fits in this. My family, throughout the ages in Jamaica, derive from the parish of Portland. Like I already told you, Agatha Smart, descend from Maroons. That Charlestown, Scotland, and Motown are the same one people who split it up over a period of time. And in my particular family, they had this thing where all of our progenitors, all of our people must be born in Portland. All of us. As long as you derive from our bloodline, and if a female within our family got impregnated anywhere throughout Jamaica, whenever it was time to give birth, they would travel from wherever they were at and give birth in the parish of Portland. Preferably either close to or on Maroon lands. Okay. When my mother became impregnated with me, right, when my mother began conceiving me, at that time she was stationed in the parish of Manchester. She was stationed at a post office because my mother was a postmaster. She was stationed in a town in Manchester by the name of Christiana. So when it was time for her to give birth, she began the journey from Christiana in Manchester to make her way to Portland, so I could be born in the parish where all of our ancestors, somehow they had mandated within the family that none of us should be born. No one by the name of Aaron should be born outside of the parish of Portland. So on the Sunday that I was born, my mother was on her way from Manchester to Portland. When she reached Kingston, my aunt at that time owned the hotel at 2 Love Lane, right beside War Theatre. And I don't know the terminology that maternity would use, but upon reaching Kingston, in order to get a transportation now from Kingston to go to Portland, she began getting birth pangs. I guess I decided I wanted to be born now. So while she was at 2 Love Lane, that was where she gave birth to me, at 2 Love Lane. And then I think she remained, from what I was told, she remained at 2 Love Lane, I believe, for 2-3 days until she recovered back from giving birth. And then I was taken to Buff Bay, Portland. And that was how my personal historical birth came about. So what basically happened is that after a while, I guess that tradition got loose. There was a part of I know it was a part of the Maroon tradition. It was a part of the larger Jamaican community tradition. But basically, whenever a person is giving birth, they would cut the navel string and bury it under a tree, and they would plant the tree sometime. They would plant the seed of a particular tree with the navel string. And then as you go, they would tell you, there is where your navel string is buried. That tree is yours. And for some strange reason, you would actually feel a sense of ownership of that tree. And I can remember as a youth walking through my family ancestral's land, and they would point to trees and tell you whose navel string was buried under which particular tree. Your aunt's navel string is there, your grandparents' navel string is there, your brothers, your sisters, and that was on and so forth. And that was also a part of the Maroon history, that even my ancestors maintained, even when there were births being taken place in my family outside of the Maroon enclaves. So even though at a particular time, my parents had moved away from the Maroon town, moved away from Portland, moved into Kingston, began living in Kingston within the 1950s. We had still maintained a strong part of the Maroon history and a strong part of the native black Jamaican history of the island. So that's basically what I wanted to speak on in terms of my experience in visiting Moortown. And I really and truly believe that there needs to be an official revisiting of the historical actions of my ancestors, the Maroons in Jamaica. We need to get away from these colonial names, Moortowns, Charlestowns, Catal, Flagstaff. We need to get away from these names. We need to go up in a more conscious level where we see the importance of changes these names. How can you change a place name from Nannytown to Moortown and then try to justify that name by trying to attach it to some name that derived from North Africa, when we know in reality the name Moortown did not derive from there. It had derived from some superintendent that was imposed upon the community by the British government. So until the next time, brethren and sisters, that's my take on that. And again, like I said, this is not to offend any Maroon. This is not to be a traitor against my own people. It's just facing the fact, facing the historical record, that there are times when we played a positive role that must be acknowledged, that should be acknowledged, not only in the liberation of Jamaica, but in the liberation of the African race throughout the entire world. But at the same time, we must acknowledge the negative part that we played in suppressing liberation wars throughout Jamaica. And until we face those two aspects of our history and address them squarely and make the necessary conscious development that will bring about changes in certain terminologies that we have come to accept, and now using that fake sense of history to derive tourism dollars so you can survive, is a shame. And that aspect of our history must be addressed and looked squarely in the face and acknowledge and issue an apology to the Jamaican people, because at the same time, even though we are Maroons, we are Jamaican people at the same. Our blood spill and cross every border and section upon this island. So until next time, brethren and sisters, peace out.